Hello, my name is Jean-Jacques. Some people would like everybody to believe that the coming economic depression will be caused by the coronavirus pandemic. It's false. The crisis had begun much before and was easy to predict for anyone who cared about the rapid decline of our natural environments. As I explained in the book I published in Amazon.ca, the stable, comfortable, and seemingly indestructible planet we live on has been created by 4 billion years of evolution, an evolution that has been deeply disturbed about 10,000 years ago when humans invented agriculture and started to cut forests. Things went from bad to worse in the 18th century when the English launched the Industrial Revolution that would rapidly spread like wildfire all over the planet. If the Industrial Revolution would prove to be very destructive, it was because most of our industrial enterprises have never been profitable. If their balance sheets often showed a profit, it was because their owners didn't pay for the pollution they produced. If the natural world and agriculture are cyclical by nature, our industrial societies are not. They pollute to collect the raw materials they use. They pollute to transform them in finished products. They pollute to consume those products. And they pollute again to get rid of them. In the first video I published on YouTube about the coming economic depression, I explained that an era of negative growth was coming due to the fact that the exponential growth of our industrial world was destroying the planet which produces the air, the clean water, and the food mankind consume. In the second video of the series, I explained that we won't have enough time to react due to the acceleration of history caused by that exponential growth. In the third video of the series, I showed that the crisis would affect all the planet but would be much worse in the poorest regions of the world. Nowadays, humans believe that they can solve most of their problems simply by growing the world economy. If poverty increases in the poorest countries, we simply send more foreign aid. If our fields become less productive, we use more fertilizers and pesticides. If air pollution becomes intolerable, we build higher chimneys to spread the pollution on a much larger surface. Dilution is then the solution. If petroleum is becoming scarcer, we simply drill deeper and farther on land or on the oceans, etc. If that mentality has become so common, it is because most humans and almost all our deciders live in artificial cities where people don't realize that Mother Earth is dying. We are really too many on the planet. We consume way too much. Even in the middle of deserts, we build gigantic and totally artificial cities. In many countries, air pollution has become so important that it is sometimes visible from space. On the continents, an ever-growing number of enterprises poison an ever-growing number of natural environments. In certain cases, for instance in Chernobyl or in Fukushima, Japan, the damage done is irreversible. All over the world, the forests and the jungles are systematically exploited and destroyed. Yes, we do plant every year billions of trees, but anybody who camped in those tree farms knows that very few plants or animals live there. What we do to the oceans is even worse. First, our industrial fishermen work very hard to catch as many fish as possible before their competitors. Second, we have built some 1,500 offshore oil platforms all over the world which sometimes malfunction and pollute entire oceanic regions. The best example of it being the huge oil slick created in 2010 by the Deepwater Horizon sinking in the Gulf of Mexico. We must also take into account the gigantic oil spills caused during the last decades by the shipwreck of multiple oil tankers. Our cargoes and our rivers have also discharged so much trash in the oceans that enormous concentrations of plastic waste can now be found in the vast natural whirlpools oceanographers call gyres. The problem is so huge that innumerable oceanic beaches are now littered with trash in countries as far away as Singapore, Hawaii, Jamaica, Spain, Ghana in Black Africa, and even on the shores of an isolated body of water like the Red Sea in Egypt. Because our leaders came from an industrial world whose growth almost never stopped during the last 250 years, their heads are full of ideas and theories which belong to another century. Psychologically speaking, they are unable to understand that the decline of almost all our natural environments has increased so much our industrial and social costs that the old economist tricks they learned in business school can no longer work. In the Western world, the problem is compounded by the fact that our elites have been so rich for so long that they became decadent. Since a consumer morality is the exact opposite of a producer morality, our leaders decided decades ago to justify their decadent way of living by putting all the normal values upside down. For them, progress is to do the exact opposite of what their ancestors have been doing for the last 10,000 years. For them, progress is not to adapt to their environment, but to keep going forever in a straight line. In that regard, they are perfectly in tune with our industrial world, which is destroying the planet at an accelerated pace. For our leaders, the environment is something far away and a little annoying. It is a secondary problem like illegal immigration or the war on drugs, which explains why they give so little money to their environmental ministries. For instance, in 2019, the US government had budgeted only $6.1 billion for its Environmental Protection Agency out of a total budget of $4,529 billion. It's very clear that our elites don't have the theories, the ideas, the concepts, and especially the technologies that would allow them to organize and manage an ever-shrinking economy. They just don't know what to do. Since the bursting of the internet bubble in 2000, our bankers and our politicians have tried to kickstart the economy by printing money like crazy and by lowering the interest rates to almost zero. When they realized it wasn't working and that their jobs were at stake, those dinosaurs of another millennium decided to hide their incompetence by doing some data tampering. For instance, they stopped registering as unemployed all the discouraged people who had stopped looking for a job. Then a miracle occurred. The coronavirus came to their rescue by giving them a convenient excuse for the inevitable economic depression they knew was coming. Despite the fact that the COVID-19 pandemic is clearly less dangerous than the 1918 Spanish flu that killed between 25 and 50 million people worldwide, they use the mass media to create an artificial panic in the population, and they issue a general stay-at-home order which could very well be useless since countries like Sweden got the same general health results than us without playing with their citizens' rights. Since we're talking about the excuses used by our leaders, it's important to mention that if the COVID-19 really came from Wuhan in China, it's ridiculous to say that the Chinese leaders used it to kill foreigners, since they were aware that such a biological weapon could backfire and kill their own families. It's also pretty strange that some governments waited from after the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic to classify as dangerous a medication like the hydroxychloroquine, which has been used extensively throughout the world for 80 years without producing any important side effects. If it's wise to follow all the stay-at-home rules imposed by our governments because dying is usually bad for your health, it's clear that our politicians should have prepared a long time ago much more elaborate strategies to cope with such a pandemic. By bringing to a standstill a large proportion of the world economy for months, they risk to make the coming economic depression even worse. The fact that the present generations are living multiple firsts is a clear indication that something really fundamental has changed on the planet. For the first time in history, most countries don't make enough kids to replace their population. The first time that the majority of humans live in cities. The first time that some politicians seriously suggest that we should eliminate all the borders. And never before mankind has been linked by a fast and global communication system like the internet. Never in the past the world has been so indebted, and nobody can recall a time when there were negative interest rates in countries like Japan, Denmark, or Sweden. This is so crazy that modern investors can become rich simply by borrowing money. Recently, we even saw on the market petroleum with negative prices, which is an economic aberration. It's also the first time that many governments have decided to shower people with what is called helicopter money, an expression invented in 1969 by Milton Friedman, who insisted to say that such an expedient to boost demand should not be used on a regular basis. One of the reasons why our present-day leaders cannot cope with the situation is because they no longer know what is going on. They know that the official statistics they work so hard to falsify cannot be trusted. Since the subprime crisis of 2008, they also know they cannot trust the credit rating agencies who had given their highest credit ratings to banks and enterprises who would have been bankrupt without the financial help of our government. In 2008, the discovery that Bernard Madoff, the former chairman of the Nasdaq, organized a $50 billion fraud that lasted more than 25 years, also showed them that official agencies like the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission were so underfunded and so understaffed that they couldn't do their job properly. Recently, our central banks also stopped playing their traditional role of regulators when they decided to buy the rotten obligations emitted by some of the worst indebted companies of the world. that massive and unorthodox intervention disrupted so much the financial markets that the Dow Jones stopped going up and down according to the good or the bad news coming from the real economy. After collapsing in March 2020, when the coronavirus crisis became really serious, the Dow Jones quickly moved back up to 24,000, where it stayed for many weeks despite the publication of an ever-growing list of economic sectors that would be severely impacted by the lockdown of the world economy. The same strange inertia was observed when the US government revealed that 30 million more Americans had filed for unemployment between March 15 and April the 30th, 2020. Apparently, the only question our present-day investors and traders are interested in is how many billions of dollars the government or the central banks will throw in the market in the coming days or weeks. As usual, you can verify everything I say by using the bibliography I will put at the end of the video. If the trillions of dollars printed during the last decade by the central banks of the world created multiple financial bubbles without being able to restart the world economy, it's because it's much easier to make money in the fantasy world created by our financiers than in the real brick-and-mortar world where entrepreneurs must deal on a daily basis with mountains of regulations and with the growing costs of a complex and rapidly deteriorating natural and human environment. In the 21st century, the artificial nature of our financial markets is increased by the fact that in 2017, for example, half of the New York Stock Exchange activity was controlled by high-speed computers that ignored what they were doing and didn't even know they existed. In a world where stocks are bought and sold by machines in a matter of milliseconds, humans are becoming more and more irrelevant. That also is a first. Obviously, such an artificial situation cannot last, and the system should self-destruct not long after our debt-ridden governments will have saved the banking system by throwing at it trillions of dollars of public money they don't have. That's the recipe they used during the subprime crisis of 2008. To avoid such a catastrophic outcome, deciders like Christine Lagarde, the lawyer who is in charge of the European Central Bank, said that our governments could simply annul their national debts. There are at least two problems with that artificial solution. First, it doesn't exist an unpaid debt. There is always somebody, somewhere, who loses money. Second, if our leaders can steal other people's savings, they cannot write off the environmental debts they accumulated for decades with the simple stroke of a pen. Nowadays, most people don't realize that our national debts are taxes that they will have to pay sometimes and somehow in the future. Inflation also is a tax that is regularly levied by the private bankers who control our central banks. I made a video on that subject. Something similar can be said about the pension plans workers have always been so happy to finance and which will soon be totally empty. The truth of the matter is that pension plans are nothing more than a taxation system which transfers money from those who work to those who have retired. I have also made a video on that. The idea that future generations will pay for the mountains of debts our generation has accumulated is a pipe dream. They will refuse to pay. I would, and you would. Most probably, those debts will be paid during our retirement years by an important reduction of our standard of living. Essentially, when the trillions of dollars created by our governments out of thin air will have become worthless. It happened in the past, for instance, in the German Weimar Republic of the 1930s, in the 2008 Zimbabwe of Robert Mugabe, or in present-day Venezuela. What I showed you in this video is that our economists, our bankers, and our politicians have lost contact with reality. Because they lived all their professional lives in the artificial world they created themselves, they ended up believing that printing and throwing around tons of money would force the economy to grow. They forgot that something like the Dow Jones is a simple instrument, a sort of thermometer that tells them what is going on in the real world. Those who manage our modern economies seem to believe that putting a candle under a frozen thermometer could create summer in January. Unfortunately, the real world doesn't work like that. These days, all the scientific data we have at our disposal show that our natural environments are really collapsing. It's obvious that if our most basic support system is failing, the industrial world it supports will also fail. When billions of people will be unemployed, when misery will be widespread even in USA, our politicians will probably try to fill their coffers by overtaxing the petroleum before its price goes up again. If tricks like that could work for a little while, they won't change the fact that the economy will have gone in a tailspin as it did in the 1930s. The riots that will create will then become so common that it will become physically dangerous to raise any more taxes. To milk a cow, it is always essential that it stops moving. I will conclude this video by saying that if we all end up telling our 6-year-olds that Santa Claus doesn't exist, it is mainly because they have become clever enough to understand that without money, it's impossible to be that generous. Sorry folks, but Santa Claus doesn't exist. I will talk about hope, because there is hope, in a future video. As usual, I thank you in advance to share this video on the internet, to like it, to subscribe to my channel, and to help me financially. See you next time.